Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final panel of FACT 2025. Please stay with us. I promise you, it will be worth it. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways of Greater Melbourne, the people of the Kulin Nation, and recognise that ACME is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We also pay our respects to elders past and present and extend our respect to First Nations people who are here today and the First Nations owners of all the lands from which you come. My name is Katie Russell and I am the National Director and CEO of the Australian Museums and Galleries Association. And it's my great pleasure to be here with such an esteemed group of panellists to explore the idea of future heritage. Heritage is a sticky and contested term. It's often linked to physical sites or objects, yet paradoxically, it can be difficult to pin down. Are we talking about natural, cultural, or intangible heritage? Whose heritage is recognised? And what stories are told, whether in institutions or online or anywhere else? Through our conversations in recent weeks, one thing has become clear. Heritage is really hard to pin down as a concept. And it's certainly not static. It shifts in response to changing social and political forces, and while it can be co-opted or challenged, it remains deeply embedded in people's lives and communities. So basically, today, what we're talking about in this final session, when you've got heaps of brain space, is all our inheritances and how they inform our possible futures. A nice, gentle final panel for the second day of FACT 2025. So, as I said, please do stick with us, and I promise it will be worth it. Our aim today is to move beyond abstract definitions and instead hear real stories and lived experiences of heritage and how it's vivified. And hear that from our panellists and how heritage shows up in their work. So despite shifts in where people invest their energy and the challenges of bad faith actors manipulating history, we hope to move beyond, as Seb said, the fumes of the 20th century, to explore what still gives us cause for optimism in the field of heritage. So to begin, I'd love to hear from each of our panellists and for them to introduce themselves and briefly share a word or two about what heritage means to them. So I'll start with you, Bianca.
Right, Nara. I'm Dr. Bianca Beetson, as mentioned. I'm a proud Kabi Wiradjuri and Ngamba woman, and it's my honour to be here. And I just wanted to also honour everybody's ancestors who walk with you every day and join us, and the thousands and thousands and thousands of years of heritage that, you know, and knowledge that's been passed down from generations that inform everything we do. And, you know, and I think about those that have come before us and the shoulders of giants we stand on. I'm the Director of First Nations at the Queensland Museum, and I'm also on the board of the Gallery of Modern Art. I'm the chair of the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair, and I have a background as an academic and have sort of spent many years sort of working in that First Nations art, creative, cultural restoration, cultural repatriation and cultural maintenance space. And I, was cultural heritage manager for Kabi people for many years. Actually, while I was doing my doctorate, I was also managing cultural heritage, which is absolutely nuts if anyone's ever been in that space. As well as a practicing artist. And as a practicing artist, I've always worked very closely around that sort of very much looking at my identity as an Aboriginal woman, but also as a woman with Scottish heritage, and, this dual sort of identity and, that I embrace every day and the two worlds that I walk between. And, even in my work and everything I do, I'm a bit of I've always been able to manage to walk between those two worlds. In fact, Aboriginal people often walk in three. And I've been able to act most of my life as a bit of a conduit for Aboriginal communities and government, or Aboriginal communities and universities, or researchers, and sort of being able to create these safe spaces and be able to give guidance for both non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people to be able to build relationships of trust and cultural understanding, and and I think that's probably my superpower.
Fabulous.
Amazing.
Emily Siddons, your
Hi,
superpower,
everyone.
please.
My superpower. Oh, geez, ask the team who are here. Hi, my name's Emily. I'm the co-CEO and artistic director of the National Communication Museum, or NCM. We are the new kids on the block of the cultural sector. We opened at the end of September in Hawthorn. We're trying to drive the creation of a new STEAM precinct, and broadly we're exploring our relationship with technologies and the role that they play in our lives. Or as Arts Hub said recently, we're boosting the cultural credibility of that area. So that's my favourite quote yet. But we've been, speaking a lot about heritage in our team. In fact, this week we said, should we throw the term out altogether? We have very fiery conversations, and I think that is one of the best parts about our organisation. But I love starting with, the writings of De Silva, because she speaks so sort of eloquently about that balance between ageing, decay, transformation, and the complex baggage of these heritage objects. And we encountered a lot of complex baggage around this collection. But there's also this wonderful potential for, redefinition, reorientation, and just reimagining the potential for experimental heritage practice. And I think often the challenge to museums, certainly what I've experienced in my career, is just how much weight we give to preserving the past compared to engaging with the current or the future. And there was such a wonderful opportunity with NCM to sort of reimagine this relationship. For those of you who don't know, the nucleus of this museum is this heritage telecommunications collection. But by virtue of the way it was acquired by volunteers over many, many years, there's a lot of duplication, non-collection items. These were tools of communication that were used in domestic settings or in public spaces or commercial contexts. In many ways, they were designed to be used and in some instances abused on a daily basis. So it seemed incredibly wrong to then take this type of a technology collection and put it behind glass and put passive didactics around it. So much of a fundamental part of that cultural story and the impact was around the interaction and experiencing these technologies. So we came up with our own terminologies around primary objects. Okay, we will have a very high quality collection that we preserve and that is untouchable. We have activated objects that may have been tampered with or maybe, the subject of many duplications. So what can we do in terms of offering them up for repurposing, recontextualization, being reimagined by artists, whether it's a switchboard synthesizer or an AI radio station using 1930s radios that we're working on at the moment. How can we kind of breathe new life into historical technologies and make them relevant again for new audiences? And there's a few other categories which I won't go into detail. So I think we're in a space of experimentation and of playing with the potential of heritage, what it means to us, and how we bring audiences along for this journey with us, I suppose.
Thank you. Larissa.
Hi everyone, I'm Larissa Hjorth. I'm from RMIT University. I'm a digital ethnographer and an artist, and I think I'm wearing the hat today of one of the projects that I'm working on, which is an Australian Research Council linkage with ACME and with AMaGA. And there are many, many people in that team, so there's no I in team. And in that project we're looking at museum audiences and methods around museum audiences and how we can actually embrace in a time of post-truth. You thought I was going to say post-Trump, I wish. Post-truth and co-creation, and how something like heritage can really grapple with that moving dynamic rhythm. In the project, we really try to look at thinking about methods, we want to push beyond surveys which are extractive, which are blunt instruments, and which do not get at social practice. The meaningful part for museum audiences is the social practice, the fact. And so taking, say, likes as a metric takes the digital out of the social, and we want to put it back in the methodology. So it's a very methods driven. We follow 10 households for 2 years, and we do many, many co-creation workshops with audiences in order to understand these kind of plural storytelling and the kind of things that they want to see in museums, and really get into what kind of methods the sector could be using to capture that social practice much more. And I think that gets to the heart of what heritage is. It is about social practice. And I love the way that DeSilvi pushes it beyond loss, although there's nothing wrong with thinking about loss, but we need to think, for example, if you think about grief and loss, we need to think about it as actually something that never goes away and actually makes us who we are, and to acknowledge it as actually something that is part of our hopeful futures. And the more that we look into that, the more that we can understand the kind of systems that need to change to move that way. So, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name's Elliott. Usually I refer to myself as the grumpy cat of arts marketing, but probably a more relevant hat for this conversation off the hat racks that we all have is my work over an extensive number of years in the open community space. So work with the Creative Commons projects and more recently with the Wikimedia community. And it's a kind of interesting idea thinking about the wiki platforms in a conversation about heritage and the future of heritage, because you've got this kind of dynamic where the GLAM sector, as far as it is a sector, doesn't necessarily think of the wiki platforms as part of that sector. And in the same way, the Wikimedia community often doesn't think of itself as part of the heritage or GLAM space either. Yet both of them are largely following similar types of pursuits, and in particular within the wiki space, you know, Wikipedia is often the platform people know, but there are a number of other wiki platforms within the ecology, and in particular platforms like Wikimedia Commons and Wikisource hold significant repositories of cultural heritage material. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic there as to who holds heritage and how they hold that, and who is making knowledge around that heritage. And so, you know, I think there's a dynamic there that's worth teasing out as to what a kind of a rethought understanding of the GLAM sector as custodians of cultural heritage might look like, and who else can be within the scope of that.
We like to call, I'm jumping in, sorry. We like to call the GLAM sector the culture institutes of memory, because I think that's a nicer way of sort of framing what we do.
And I think we'll come back to that concept of time and, you know, differing societal conceptions of time and what that means for heritage, living heritage. Does it always have to refer to the past? And because it's such an amorphous topic, as we've alluded to in all of our introductions, and some of you referred to Caitlin DeSilvi, that was a touch point for us from the built heritage sector to really think about, to ground our conversation and to start it somewhere. So it's very much about, you know, the built environment, but I think it speaks to heritage as the broadest possible topic. So DeSilvi's concept of curated decay challenges the idea that is, well, it's the prevailing ethos in many memory institutions, that heritage must always be stabilised and preserved in the state of whatever people think is the highest value, whether it's when the artist painted it and it came into the collection, etc., and in many permutations. But I'd like to ask the panel, how do we reconcile this this instinct to save, to be saviours, and to save things, with the idea of letting go or choosing to tell a different story? And can doing something different also be an act of care?
Look, I think I sort of touched on this in my sort of introduction. But I think we've, I don't know if people really understand the background about NCM, but we are a true startup in all senses of the word. So we were sort of seed funded by industry, gifted the site of the museum and Old Telephone Exchange, a site for our collection, the collection itself, and on your way. So with that, it has given us the ability to actually think about all of these things that we speak so often about in large museums, and I spent a long time in sort of state-run large museums, about decentralised collections, about letting go, about thinking, asking the questions of, are we the best place to house this collection? So do we need an entire collection of yellow pages, or they exist in the National Archives, so can we get rid of them, give them to a community centre, find a place that would actually use them in a new way, in a more meaningful way, arguably. So we're doing a lot of really exciting work in that space. What we've realised from that piece of work is that we probably only need 30% of the collection store that we house. And so can we think about creating a shared storage facility, a shared storage initiatives where we give that to another museum to rent, thereby creating this wonderful kind of shared facility where we're working together and sharing knowledge and then using that to fund the operations of the museum. So it's quite a radical concept. Museums by nature are hoarders, and I always describe myself as a complete minimalist. So in some ways I ask, am I the right person to be in this role? But I think it's the minute you give yourself license to question, to ask, well, what is the point of having a million sort of pieces of corporate memorabilia? Does it tell anything about the story of Australia and what it means and the significance to people? Or is it, Jeff Class of 2005 who won the award for, best technician on the ground? So it's kind of the really interesting and really hard questions, and who has the authority to make those decisions. But in doing so, you broaden out that conversation. You're able to elevate other voices, and particularly those who are often silenced and are not heard, and create space to do new things that are really exciting. So that is the space we're thinking in the moment.
Yep. Excellent.
I just thought I'd add to that. A big part of my job is actually managing repatriation for the state of Queensland. So I'm in the role of making sure that things are going back to communities, but 90% of the time, communities aren't ready. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing is, the way we look at and address cultural heritage, from a First Nations perspective at the museums, that material does not belong to the museum at all. It belongs to the community. We're just custodians of it. And so we need to sort of start thinking about that. We are custodians. We have to look after things to the best we can, and we have to be damn good custodians. And, and when community come out the back, sometimes it's the first time they've ever seen objects from their country. Some of these objects 300 years old. And the tears of joy that community shed when they reunite with these objects makes you realise how important it is to care for these items, because many of these items weren't made to last forever. They were made to go back to the earth. So it's a bit of a sort of challenge. We do sometimes struggle with that. But on the other hand, given the number of people with stolen generation background and the way our communities were torn apart and the way we were removed from country, is our opportunity to start to reconnect with our culture and identity. And start understanding who we are. And having been in that art space for years, the number of artists we've brought through who have been able to repatriate resting cultural knowledge through museum collections, understanding the way that knot was, what type of string it is, and really get these intimate understandings from these items that predate colonisation are so important. So, it as I said, it is a kind of an odd concept, but on the other hand, we're also saying, well, these belong to community. We care for them on behalf of community. And, and that's that sort of, and quite often I get questioned around, but they're going to come and we're doing a big return later on this year, and it's a lot of it's general collection. It'll be the first time we've taken general collection back to community. And so the curators and everything and the collection managers, they get a bit grumpy at me at the moment. But I said, look, this is not our material. Repatriation is unconditional. And when you look at the UNDRIP, it does say unconditional repatriation of cultural material. So, I just tell them, oh, well, too bad.
Give it back.
Yeah, that's right.
That does kind of lead me into the whole nature of how things are cared for and where that might rub up against First Nations knowledge systems and the way of understanding what that object represents or the artefact represents. And I think that that example that you give around, the traditional, the cataloguer, the person who got it in the system, did all the catalogue entry, lots of hard work. We respect that, but prizing their fingers off it because it's understood in their manner, in a colonialist, method. How and is that preventing people coming in from community and actually accessing what is their cultural heritage? These gates are there about Western systems.
Yep, I mean, the gatekeepers have been, a major problem for a long time. I mean, part of the work I'm doing is opening the collection. It can be tricky from a cultural safety perspective. We still have to have cultural community processes in place. So we don't let people just willy-nilly, particularly researchers wanting to come in, they have to have approval from community. But also a lot of community don't know what we have. So, I've gone from a team of 2 to 9 in the last 12 months. And we're out there actively involved in the community. Every time we step out, we have more people. So, we had a group of 30 different people from different mobs all over come in recently through, they were a Nambour men's group, and we were just giving them a general back of house tour. And we pull out this drawer, and in that drawer was an object. And that object, it was a breastplate, and it was connected to his grandfather. And it was one of those situations where I just went, oh my God, that shouldn't have happened, because he was emotional because there was bullet holes in these breastplates. And I was like, we can't do that again, and I started rethinking about how much access do we give people. So I emailed him and I spoke to him and I said, look, how do you want us to deal with this item? So we've taken it out with you, we've deaccessioned it, and it's now going to be returned. So out of that situation, it's actually led to a repatriation conversation. And it's not just that, but there's a whole heap of other objects that the elders came in and they've spent time. So it is a really difficult thing about, making these collections available and accessible. But, how do we make sure cultural safety is there in everything we do for the community, for our staff? And sometimes we don't get it 100% right, but it turns into a good story at the end. So every time we have somebody come in, and, it just makes more and more work. I mean, my team, I probably could double again in 12 months with the amount of repatriation requests, with the amount of community access, artists, community, people wanting to re-engage with their cultural material. But we've also made it really clear how they can access it and made it easy. And that's the thing. It's because the problem is we have, we've had these non-Indigenous gatekeepers for a long time. So when they reach out, they actually speak to First Nations peoples. And that helps break one of the barriers down because they're speaking to mob. And we understand that if they've got, we can't talk to that. We've stolen generation or blah, 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 and we can help support them navigate that red tape as well.
And surely it adds to the broader understanding of the work that the museum holds in trust or is going back to the community.
Yeah. And a lot of that information on our databases is terrible. It doesn't, it privileges the collector. It doesn't actually privilege the makers or anything. Half the time we're still trying to find out what mob it comes from, what country it came from. There's so little information. It's just, Roth collected this in blah, 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 blah. So when communities come through, they often give us so much more information. So we've got a whole heap of people writing things down or recording things. And we add that to the database because it's so important. We had a group come through recently and they went, I made that, and then this other, because my grandmother put the feathers on it. We took photos of those people to go with the collection and took their story because it's so important. We're always continuing to build knowledge.
Absolutely. Elliott, is there some equivalence or issues around what is said and whose heritage is highlighted in the Wikimedia sphere?
I mean, absolutely. I guess in some ways the wiki platforms are kind of saving cultural heritage by consensus, I guess. as an example, how many people have edited a page on Wikipedia before? Okay, so about half the room. Of those, how many have had their changes reverted? Had somebody take it down, right? So that is a kind of this example of how the wiki platforms kind of decide through the community what's kept and what's not, but also that these things are iterative and they change over time, that Wikipedia articles don't stay relatively static, they tend to be dynamic. But also in thinking about and looking at that as a kind of a local chapter of the Wikimedia Foundation, knowing that First Nations knowledge and other types of knowledge are added to the platforms, that's been an area that's been really important to Wikimedia Australia, and that we've been thinking a lot about how to address that reality. And so one of the things that we're working on with Terry Jenke and company is the development of an ICIP protocol for Wikimedia Australia, but which can also act as a signalling of recommended practice in how Wikipedians engage with First Nations knowledge and bring it onto the platform. So it's an interesting kind of process for the wiki platforms, because whether they like it or not, they are the product of a Western global North knowledge system, even if they don't think that or don't know that. And so they inherit a range of processes and ways of privileging certain types of information, emphasizing things like verifiable sources, etc. And that this means that certain ways or practices of generating knowledge become part of how that community works. And so there's an important piece there about recognizing that there are other ways of knowing, being and doing, but also that it's not our place to make decisions about how that happens. So we're undertaking this process because also the Wikimedia movement is huge and global, but these sorts of issues are not necessarily widely understood across the whole movement. And so we see a role for the Australian chapter to work with First Nations communities to develop a self-determined protocol that can then help at least good actors in the wiki community identify the preferred ways or the recommended ways of working with First Nations knowledge. Of course, bad actors are going to be bad actors. Racist fuckwits who want to be racist will be. But we can at least support good actors to understand what First Nations communities want and need in relation to their knowledge being part of these international platforms.
Absolutely, and I think the audience is very invested in this conversation, and a comment here, letting go of difficult histories where certain groups are still living the effects of those histories can't be an act of care. And when the word curator has a derivation from the Latin to care, it brings up a lot of issues and a lot of emotion, and that's certainly not going away, and I think that's understood but can never be reconciled. So in terms of bringing the bricks and mortar, the 2x4 plywood museums together with the somewhere, meeting in the middle with what the Wikicommons represent, there's a comment here, or question: should more institutions collaborate on collection search tools and systems? And I think that speaks to your idea of the utopian, distributed national collection we hear a lot about. How could that be pioneered? I think we're already hearing, potential options there. So keep listening, people. Glad to hear you're awake. But one example is in this great state of Victoria, and that's called Victorian Collections, run out of AMaGA, Victoria. Just saying. Okay. So heritage in the context of modern challenges is where I thought we'd go next. So, no brainer. We're navigating an era of AI. We hear these words: post-truth and climate crisis, the wicked problems that not only face the cultural heritage sector, but the whole world. But it all disrupts traditional notions of heritage if we're thinking about museums and galleries. So how do people on the panel see museums and cultural institutions adapting to these forces? And could you share some examples from your own work that highlight creative or unexpected responses to such challenges?
Audience, again. No.
I zoned out.
That's right, it was long. It was long-winded. It's really, in a nutshell. Okay. Other voices. Bringing in unexpected voices to talk about collection items.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Got one?
I can
Larissa's
do this
in.
one. I can do.
All right.
Okay. Yeah. I actually have a slide. Is there Peter's comment?
Yes.
Yeah,
I will bring.
Because
up
I just
your
wanted to
slide.
bring in as an ethnographer, it's really important that I bring the people that I'm actually working with and their kind of voice to the forefront. So this study that we're doing, which is a 3-year study, we've been going into people's homes. We're doing that for 2 years. So we're really trying to understand the museum as part of a broader understanding of their kind of social practices, and the digital is embedded in there. And I think Peter, who is a really, really interesting and engaged museum goer, who takes his grandchildren along. So this story of the intergenerational is really, really important for him. He sees museums play a really powerful role as those kind of, for really fostering intergenerational storytelling. And he wants them to do more. And he wants more of that kind of allowing for those kind of pluralistic stories to come out. And he wants to be with his grandchildren doing that sense making. And we see story and story again of these desires by audiences. They see that the museums can do so much, in a time where governments are not doing that much, and in a time when we're seeing great inequalities, and we're seeing the digital is only just emphasising those inequalities across access and across literacy. And I'm just thinking, Indigo, are you out there because you did the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which is a really important example of just how those inequalities play out. And yet museums can be these spaces, these social practice spaces that can actually do something so powerful for community and for people. So I think this quote by him is like basically wanting to see more transparency around collections and actually putting those contested things out there so that you're actually engaging with the audience as co-curators to see these stories as sense-making. And this, by giving them that agency, it actually empowers them to, of course, you do want to take care, and so you do want to just not put out every single thing. Like we don't want, necessarily all of certain kind of, dare I say, I think we know the names I'm thinking of, kind of propaganda around storytelling, but we want informed storytelling that allows for those diversities and gives audiences that kind of agency and participation to actually sense make, because stories are empathy machines. That's how we understand and learn, and museums are such important sites for that.
I think building off that point, it really speaks to our approach building NCM, where, this technology collection, it was truly sort of a democratic sort of starting point to build a storytelling around our collections. Because if you think about it, these are tools of communication that it is really their sort of mass adoption by people that either ensure their ubiquity or their rejection of these tools that turn them into kind of relics. And so we were able to find sort of a way into the story from so many different perspectives, whether they're the people that built the technology, used the technology, received the messages, sent the messages, and sort of thinking about that as a way to sort of uproot the dominant narrative and bring in multiple voices. I think that for us has been particularly successful. And when we think about, I guess, heritage, or the sort of nostalgia machine that everyone loves to talk about at the moment, we're really seeing this lovely sort of intergenerational piece coming to fruition where, grandparents are showing their kids how a rotary dial works, and the kids are showing their parents something about Gen AI, and everybody finds a moment of nostalgia and a point of connection. And I think, Jemima, our curator, and I spent 3 hours with Tim from The Age going through the museum, and I got to the end of that tour and just thought, what is he going to write about? I mean, I don't even know what we covered in that amount of time. And the article came out and the headline was, NCM is where grandparents get their tech cred back. And I was like, of all the things we spoke about, that was sort of the little point of departure, which I kind of loved. So I think, it really speaks to kind of our approach and how we've been thinking about storytelling.
And that they're memory institutions, as you said, Bianca.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that about sort of thinking about the voice of country and how do we bring the voice of country into our museums. And, a lot of the work that I do steps between, the tangible and the intangible cultural heritage. How do we sense, because, I work in a very, I have to work in a very spiritual space, but all around we go to places and we can feel that something bad's happened on that country or we shouldn't be there. So we're trying to so I've been doing a lot of, as an artist, my practice, I do a lot of recording of frontier war sites, massacre sites, and work recording the sounds of trees and things like that may have been witness trees to the frontier wars, or listening to waterways and things like that. So we're, and we're now we're saying, well, how do we apply that within the museum space? Because you can feel it. It's this low vibration. Sometimes, and using things like transducers to be able to actually just touch, and you can feel the heartbeat of a tree, or you can feel the deep spirit of country. And so country has a voice, and how do we bring that in? Because it's more, and it's about our living culture that we talk about. We always sort of see history and heritage as remnants of the past. So so that's one of the challenges that I'm working through at the moment in the museum, but also thinking about our artifacts and objects. They have a heartbeat, they're living, they're breathing, they've still got their ancestors attached. How do we honour that? How do we, it's not just them putting them in a cupboard, putting a label on. What do they sound like? What do they breathe like? And then, what does that tree that they were taken from, and sort of retracing and remapping them back to country as well. So it's, I think I sometimes freak people out when we have these big, curatorial meetings, because I sort of get in this sort of weird, because I don't have time to practice, so I put it all into my, so it's something we need to think about. How do we, because country has a voice.
Absolutely. Yeah, so intergenerational and interspecies.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really, really important point to make, is that when we built NCM, the first role I hired was a First Nations curator and this wonderful multidisciplinary team. And for the first few weeks, we just sat in a room questioning everything from the language we use. There's so many terms we bandy around every day, like innovation and progress, that can be harmful to First Nations, and sort of ignore the fact that technologies have existed for thousands of years. And so we spent a long time talking about seasons and cycles and different ways of thinking about time and different sort of temporal contexts. And I think that really started to inform the entire approach of NCM, which is the whole museum is non-linear. And then we think about, in every moment, can we connect past, present, future? And once you start thinking like that, it's amazing the stories that start to naturally emerge from that, where you take something as simple as the Overland Telegraph Line and you go, well, that was the first major colonial infrastructure intervention that connected Australia. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was following songlines and trade routes from First Nations peoples. And we're still traversing the same routes today through the next-gen fibre optic rollout and digital networks. So you just start to see all these cycles and these patterns emerging, and really trying to just break that museum trope of there's a First Nations commission in the foyer and then nowhere else. So I think one thing that I'm actually quite proud of at NCM is, like, almost in every single moment in the museum, there is a First Nations or Torres Strait Islander voice represented, from, the futurists to, thousands of years ago. So I think that's been quite a humbling and a very, wonderful journey to be on too.
AI's been here for 65,000 years. It's called Aboriginal intelligence.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, Jason Farman's book on waiting, he's a mobile media expert, but what he did was, he's a media archaeologist, and when he started looking at mobile media and waiting, he actually went, it goes back before the cell phone, and he mapped it back to the boomerang, and he said that was the first version of mobile media where it was put into the world and the waiting, and and so he goes into this really, and he came to Australia to study it as a key point in understanding and shifting those kind of understandings of technology as just this thing that white people did, but actually as something much more complex and very much part of cultural and social practice.
Yep, and the message stick.
Absolutely.
And speaking of messages, there's a question from the floor for everyone to respond to. And does the panel think oral history is part of heritage?
100%.
Absolutely.
For example, documenting stories told by survivors of horrible histories. Yeah. And how do you, in again, back into the bricks and mortar, built heritage museums, how do you bring to life, how do you bring the oral history in and around traditional museum artefacts to...
The tech comes in.
It's about the tech.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's for everyone to go away and think about and do better with.
I was just thinking about Jennifer's talk yesterday and the multimodal. So, like, actually being true to oral storytelling and actually hearing, and having voice, I think is really crucial, rather than thinking that it all has to go back to word or something. Yeah. So that's really kind of crucial. And thinking, like today's keynote was really great in interrogating immersion and thinking about bringing it back to embodied knowledge. And embodied knowledge is really crucial to the future of museums. Yeah.
But I think the question also speaks to the journey we've been on over the past few weeks in terms of heritage. Like once you start to think about that word, it is everything. I've been kind of interrogating and annoying my friends over the last week. What does heritage mean to you? And, well, it's everything. It's my cultural heritage. It's who I am. Like, it's so, oral history, but everything is heritage. As I said, I wasn't in jest that it is all our inheritances, and it's very hard to, extract the physical from the emotional, from,
it's all
the temporal.
Interconnected, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And we have to stop trying to separate things and
That's right.
understand that everything is all interconnected and look at things holistically rather than going, that's just scientific knowledge. And this is the problem we have with these institutions. They're so siloed. And we kind of go, well, that's sciences, that's biogeo, because I work in a natural history museum, and that's social history. And it's like, well, actually, it's all First Nations knowledges.
Yes.
Because, I quite often say, that biological material and that geological material is from this country, so it's Aboriginal culture, it's Aboriginal heritage, and so it does scare a lot of the scientists, but we're on a journey.
They need it.
But are they willing to open it up? Are they saying no?
Well, we had the first ever return of cultural heritage. Of biological material as cultural heritage from the Smithsonian recently to the Torres Strait. So there was coral returned from the Smithsonian as cultural heritage, which was the first time anything's happened under that. So I'm trying to shift and get people to reframe the way they look at cultural heritage, rather than it's just boomerangs, clapsticks, dilly bags, ancestors.
Scientific classification.
Yeah.
So in terms of thinking about that and thinking about the future and structures to support this more expanded way of thinking about heritage, we still work in systems and structures, and we've talked a lot about that, and I won't use the F word, like funding, but how do you effectively decolonise heritage practice? I know that's like a 3-week conference, but...
in one sentence or less.
Yeah, please. No, I think that there are a lot of performative gestures to that. In Australia, we've thankfully got a national cultural policy at the moment, and it puts First Nations first. And every state and territory, as far as I'm aware, is trying to build the first national Indigenous cultural centre. It's a race. It is a race. Sorry to use that word, but is this effective? What are the barriers that exist? From my experience in working in the gallery sector, it's about the people.
Yep.
It's about First Nations people in museums and galleries. the enormous load that's put on those people to be the representative of pan-indigeneity in these places, and it's absolutely terrifying because, and I think that for our sector that is probably one of the biggest challenges, but does anyone think there's other enormous barriers that we really have to overcome, so unless it's just a gesture? Lest it be just a gesture, which it can't be.
I think there's a lot of false narratives around there of, okay, well, you just have a designated role, you hire that role, and as you say, all the pressure is on that role. And we're having, really lovely conversations with Wurundjeri about, you're probably, advertise it, you're probably not going to fill it because there's not enough bodies to go around to fill that. So we spoke a lot about, we worked a lot in consulting models where we would pay really well for, meaningful integration, but that was actually achievable and worked within the timeframes and the other projects of the people participating, whether that's consultation, artists, as I said, the First Nations curator. And I found that a really successful model. For us, the challenge now is how do we convert that to ongoing engagement? Because we did advertise, we tried to convert that, and we could not find a person. And our beautiful curator, Nathan, moved interstate, and we're still in touch. But, I think that's challenging. So it's just maybe rethinking how that engagement happens and not going, well, we advertised and no one applied, so we gave up. But it's...
Exactly.
But I think that a lot of institutions do that. How does... In a volunteer setup like the Wikisphere, how does cultural protocol get adhered to? And
well, it is an interesting space because lots of people don't really understand how rules per se in the wiki environment happen. There's sort of this misconception that the Wikimedia Foundation, as the body that runs these platforms, can set editorial rules or other types of, ways of dictating how the practice happens. And that's not actually the case. It's entirely the editing community who make consensus decisions around, editorial processes, naming of things, the types of sources that can be used or that are more credible and validating in order to reinforce information that's on the platform. And in fact, it's fundamentally this dynamic that has underpinned why Wikimedia Australia is taking the approach around an Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protocol, because we know we can't set the rules, but we can signal best practice, we can educate our community around that, and we can support them to adopt that practice and incorporate it in, to internalize it into the way that they generate knowledge on the platforms. I think this notion of pluralism is a really interesting one, because there's this kind of paradox in the wiki world where you have these strong, utopianistic early internet ideas of openness and democratizing, and the fact that anyone can edit anything. They might get it revoked, but they can edit it in the first instance. You've got this kind of idea that it's all in, everybody gets a go, which fails to think about or understand or address systemic barriers for certain communities and knowledge holders. But also at the same time, while you may have the ability for anybody to get in and add to it, it still largely mimics the idea of a page of Britannica.
yes,
Right? So it still has this inherent idea that there is one truth and one knowledge and one authoritative page on a topic. And I think it's an interesting thought exercise. What would a genuinely pluralistic Wikipedia look like? I'm sure parts of my community will probably be messaging me at the moment saying, what are you talking about? But I think it's an interesting conversation.
We are the utopia already.
Yeah.
Okay, so that whole idea of, again, whose voice and whose heritage gets privileged. Heritage work and the work of the heritage sector or cultural heritage institutions is often shaped by the dominant narrative, and for us in this country, it's been colonial one. How can we better embed the collective wisdom which is there? It just needs to be heard. And as someone in the audience said, it just needs the microphone. Engaging communities, effectively engaging communities beyond those usual gatekeepers and the authoritative voice. I mean, I think that, you know, the parallel sort of reduction in trust in civic institutions generally, and then, you know, cultural institutions might follow if you are fatalistic and think that we might, you know, suffer a knock-on effect from what's happening in the British Museum, per se. So if the trust in that authority that museums, you know, used to value as their precious, how do you create cultural heritage how do you represent a heritage or plural heritages that are more inclusive and representative and therefore relevant to a broader cross-section of the community?
I think, you know, it comes down to thinking about the pros and cons of co-creation, and thinking about that not all co-creation is good. You know, like I think the Wikipedia is a great example that you always have bad actors and good actors. And I think it is about how institutions as memory keeper institutions, what they set up and how they, I mean, for me, I think it's a methods piece, and it's about that idea of deep engagement rather than kind of shallow metrics. And I think social media has flattened things a lot. And it, you know, the likes and things like that are used because institutions need to put facts and benchmarks to, you know, kind of organisations to get money and to get, but actually that's not where all the interesting things are happening. And it's detached itself from actually audiences and the real thing that audiences are thinking. And so by rethinking the methods that are used to engage, and by engage not extract, but actually about reciprocity and really involving methods which take a long time. And I know that everyone is overwhelmed and everyone is doing 10 jobs at once, but maybe we don't do those 10 jobs and we just do a couple of those jobs, but really, really deeply and really, really engage in really meaningful ways that are sustained. And so those stories do come back and that trust does build, because like as that quote from Peter wants museums to succeed, and there's a lot of, I know that, you know, there is a bit of a decline in museums going, but that's because, you know, for example, in Peter's case, he is a grandfather, he has to look after his grandchildren because the parents are working so hard because everybody's doing it hard. If the museum was much more inclusive, he would be bringing the kid in for that informal learning. Like there's so much of an opportunity for museums and the sector in general to step up at this moment where education is getting less money, people are really, you know, doing it hard financially. There's a whole lot of challenges that actually, you know, not that I want to put, it's, you know, come on museums, you can save us, we're drowning. But I think there is actually, you know, like a lot of people really still believe museums can be a space for social justice. And I think that's really, you know, if we can tap into that.
I might extend on that, because I think there's also a question about who will save museums, right? We're living in a world of bendy truth where certain players are targeting lots of institutions that hold different ideas of truth. You know, we've got a situation where Trump's declaring himself chairperson of the JFK Performing Arts Centre and firing the archivist, and, you know, you've got this kind of interesting dynamic. Somebody asked me recently, what would happen if Elon Musk tried to buy out the Wikimedia Foundation in the same way that he's proposing to buy out OpenAI? And I was like, look, even if that were possible, because the platform is open source software and the content is openly licensed or public domain, you can snip it and mirror it and take it someplace else. I think collections need to be thinking about their resilience in changing political climates, that inconvenient truths that might exist within cultural collections can make them targets in this environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that, for us, it's the sort of uncomfortable, yet we found a really lovely way to exist in that uncomfortability of moving fast and breaking things and mixing that with really meaningful long-term research projects and considered commissions. And the two can exist simultaneously, and I think we are now finding a model where, okay, we can change our minds and implement something next week, and I know we're in a luxurious position to be able to do that as a small independent organisation, but at the same time, you know, at the very beginning of this journey we realised, okay, well, there is no documented First Nation storytelling of the Overland Telegraph Line, so we raised money and straight away we funded a 3-year research project, a truth-telling project on that, knowing that it would end at the time we launched NCM. So that's just released, and we gave all the funding to Garrow, our community-led storytelling creative agency, to run that piece. And similarly, we sort of skirted around the AI question and then dodged it and ran away, but I've found a way to
Coming
weave it back.
Excellent.
Yeah. So this is another wonderful example of a long-term collaboration that ran parallel to the other development. We knew we wanted to play with AI in a sort of a meaningful way, or like gesture recognition and motion-based recognition as a way to sort of unlock content or create a more active exchange with audiences. So we're thinking a lot about ancient knowledge systems, emerging technologies, and so one of the collaborations I'm most proud of is one with Rita Seminatafa, Palala and Pika, and it was about thinking, well, how can we use gesture tracking, tools, Google Media Pipe, to sort of gamify experience where we are teaching audiences about Samoan cultural gestures in daily life. And that took 3 years because the algorithm could not recognize sort of gestures that it deemed foreign. It wasn't natural, it wasn't what it was trained on. It couldn't recognize people in wheelchairs. And it was a really lovely multi-year collaboration that could not have been done quickly, and it took a lot of time to develop, and is so much better for that development time. So I think it's a mixture of the two at the end of the day.
I was just going to say, like on the volunteerism, kind of the decline of volunteerism in the sector. I mean, I think there is like, and this is what we've been seeing with our participants, is that there is actually an opportunity here in terms of older adult demographics who actually can be stepping in. But once again, it's about that relevance piece. And
it's changing the nature of volunteering.
Yeah, absolutely. And that museums could be a really great space for, like rather than the grandfather dropping the kid off to do the VR storytelling thing and they just have to loiter around in the lobby, they can come in and it can be a moment to do that intergenerational storytelling. So there's... I think, there is an opportunity there with particularly older adults. And I mean, Australia is really, really ageist. And the kind of ways in which older adults are kind of their skill sets and everything tend to be devalued when actually there's such a richness there that could actually be, kind of helping if they felt that they were included in the sector. So I think there's a few different inclusion pieces there that...
But you've got to see yourself. That's the problem.
Yes.
Where
Absolutely.
so many, and this is where we're talking about that diversity.
Yeah.
When you go to museums and you can't see yourself, and this is where it's really important the work you've done, because you've embedded it in everything. And it's, it's not just we're going to have a standalone gallery space. That's been part of the battle I've had, we can't find money for a gallery space, but what are you doing to make sure it is included, these voices? And it's not just First Nations, it's everyone's voices are included. There's stories, there's so many interconnections. That's coming back to all the different patterns and connected. We need to be kind of doing less but more.
Effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And just really drilling down and not just looking at things from one lens. It's.
But I think Elliott's asked that question: who will save heritage? Who will save the museum sector? I mean, this volunteerism piece. It's people, of course. It's
we
people.
save ourselves. Yeah.
But the volunteering model has been broken. by that period in 2020, and that began in 2020. And I think that the statistics from Volunteering Australia, especially for the arts and culture sector, are that 40% of the volunteers who used to work, give free labour to the culture sector, didn't come back. And it's a true elephant in the room that have been always the engines on which, especially the public-facing part of museums and galleries are utterly dependent, and the educational part. And so that reinvention of volunteerism is actually critical to the future of heritage.
I might throw something in there, because I think it's interesting to interrogate what people want to do in terms of their volunteering. Like Australia has, for multiple years, been ranked 5th in terms of the number of active editors on Wikipedia, right? In the last financial year, Australians gave $6 million to the Wikimedia Foundation, right? So in those spaces, volunteerism, the idea of giving and contributing and giving back, that's not going away. And so I'm interested in how we think about where and what people are doing, and how we use that to support other parts of the cultural heritage sector, right? If people are engaging in and writing content on Wikipedia, how do we make that about elements of the cultural heritage collections that we have? So we're very interested as a local chapter in how we tell more Australian stories in a more compelling way, and how we do that in partnership with First Nations communities, with cultural heritage bodies, so that Australian stories are part of that international platform.
I think there's also a fear from a lot of volunteers, and I've seen this even through Quagoma, that some of the volunteers are now at a point where they're actually not game to talk about First Nations. Or they're worried that they're going to pronounce the traditional owners wrong and all this kind of stuff. So there has to be a whole heap of scaffolding to support and actually make those volunteers feel really comfortable with what they're doing, that the information is right and correct, and they're not going to be called out in public if they say something wrong, or but they've got to also be saying the right thing, because some of them do go off on tangents and say the wrong thing, or make things up, right? Yeah. And so
the whole hashtag overheard in the gallery. Yeah, and I think that but then who do they ask? Yes. And that's the First Nations person who, again, that cultural load lands upon, it can be a vicious cycle. But I think, to wrap up, we've seen some really interesting ways that heritage will, persevere into the future, and I think that it's not something that can ever be taken away from being human. So thank you, everyone, for your perspective, and thank you for listening and staying with us. I'd now like to welcome back Seb Chan to wrap up the day and give us a preview of what's ahead for the social functions. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you run off, let's see if this works. The last 2 days, I hope you found them as exciting as I did. That's what I promised. I hope we delivered on that. Thank you to all the speakers. As I said in those slides too, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about has been about change and collective work. As I said then, this is work we need to do together, and we've seen that all across all of the different talks we've had. To help out with that, illustrations have been being done right up the back by an amazing artist drawer. So like last year, we'll be circulating the visual summaries of each of the sessions probably next week, and the videos will be up over the next month. When they're out, feel free to share them. In fact, for 2026, actually we can do this. Like the last two, I've gone, I don't know if we're going to do it again. Thanks to Creative Australia, though, we can, and we know when it's going to be. So FACT 2026 is going to be a week earlier, February 4 to 6. We start pulling the program together and speakers sort of around April, May-ish, maybe a bit earlier. Rachel's probably going earlier. We've already got some of the internationals who we asked for this year who couldn't make it, some of whom are very keen, of course, to come. As when they see this, they'll be even more excited. Of course, But if you want to talk or you know people you think we should have, please get in touch. Of course, you know what this is like now, so we try to have panels that poke at things. We had two speakers drop out at the very last minute for various other reasons, as well as we've zoomed in some, but we like to have people physically here. But get in touch through all the normal channels. Once again, a huge thank you to our partners on this major event, Partner Creative Australia, supporting partners Bloomberg, British Council, US Consul and Creative Victoria. Thank you, see you in 2026. Get some sleep. Thank you.